Good morning, Comrade. Is this thing on? Hello? Good morning, comrades. It is Sunday fun day, baby. Let's go. Let's have some fun today. You know what? I don't feel like doing politics. Let's watch some videos instead. Like, that's just what Sundays are for, right? Like, a lot of those nerds are watching those like mainstream Sunday shows. Let's have some fun There's a video of somebody that like is teaching you how to make chocolate, like from the cocoa bean, and it's weird looking. And I think I'm gonna watch it. Is that a bad idea, Jenny? Is that a bad idea? Should we not watch a chocolate video? Anyway, how are you doing today? How's the day going? How's things up there by you? I'm just chilling, just hanging out. Yeah, well, Sunday Fun Day. I've actually corrected the spelling of supporters, not supportiers anymore. Now I actually am spelling correctly. I've got 2 more patrons: Adam R, Trey M. So that's exciting. But yeah, it's gonna be a beautiful day. It's dark in here. Oh, you know why? I don't know why. Very professional operation we got going on here. That's too bright. Better. Go. Man, if I hit my shit, that would be something, wouldn't it? There you go. Let's go. Is this thing on? The lights were not on. I gotta figure out what to do with that lamp. It always messes the lights up. It moves them around in a weird way. Anyway, here we are. Let's go. We're gonna do it. We're watching the goddamn chocolate video. Watching the goddamn chocolate video, okay? Tomorrow, I might cover the Trump speech. I know he's back. He's back. On his bullshit again. Right now, I want to watch the video. Who's with me? Alright. This is from Flavor Lab. Turn the music off.
All right, today let's go from cocoa pod to chocolate on today's super intensive video. I'm not gonna lie, although this was a lot of fun, it was also a lot of hard work. In total, the process of going from cocoa bean to chocolate bar took me about 2 months. Not because it takes that long to make, but
to go from a little bean of whatever that's what chocolate comes from?
because I messed up several times and had to start over, as well as having to deal with some camera issues along the way that didn't allow me to film. However, in my folly, I learned a lot, and I hope to pass what I learned so you don't make the same mistakes that I did. Chocolate making in general is a very complicated and intricate process, but today I'm going to be showing you my very simplistic method of making chocolate. I'm going to kind of cut corners and really reduce a lot of the complexity. However, I have to say, even with my plebeian attempt at chocolate, it still turned out really good. I ended up with a bar that was really fruity and had a lot of flavor. It was actually very delicious. So let's go ahead and begin. So chocolate making has more or less 4 steps. We have fermentation, we have a kind of drying, roasting step, we have a grinding step, and then lastly, we have kind of a heating and tempering and molding step. So let's go through this one by one. All right, step 1, let's start with our actual cocoa pods. Now these are them. They grow in deep tropical regions and they originate from Mesoamerica. However, I sourced mine from a fruit company that specializes in this exotic fruit and grows them in Miami, Florida. Now, for those keeping track at home, I'm pretty sure these are the Trinitario cultivars of cocoa. However, for this video, any kind of cocoa will work. And you can typically find
big old look coconut, like it looks like a cross between a coconut and an avocado, doesn't it? It looks kind of gross.
find them online, although it's not super cheap. So the first thing we want to do is split open these pods. Very carefully using a knife, we can cut it such that we can expose the interior of the cocoa pods. Now, I know inside it looks a little crazy. As you can see, the cocoa pod is surrounded by a shell, and inside are the actual cocoa beans.
That looks like a fucking maggot. Like, Jesus Christ. We eat that shit? That shit's delicious?
If we scoop the beans out, you can see that each bean is surrounded by some fruity, pulpy flesh. Now, this stuff is actually edible and is actually very delicious. It has almost a citrusy flavor, not at all what I expected. Now, what we're actually after is not this fruity pulp, but we're actually after the interior of these seeds. Now, if you cut one in half, you can see this kind of purpley bit. In fact, you can eat this. It is a little bitter and it has a very faint taste of chocolate, but through the process of fermentation, drying, and roasting, we're gonna reinforce the flavors of the chocolate so that in the end, we end up with this really familiar chocolate flavor. Now, I'm gonna collect the beans from 4 pods, just scooping out the interiors and collecting into a bowl. With all the beans scooped out, it's time to begin the process of fermentation. Now, the fermentation stage is extremely important in the process of making chocolate. This is the stage where a majority of the chocolate flavors and fruitiness are actually developed. And I have to admit, the process of fermentation of these beans is pretty nuanced and complicated. Expert chocolatiers have written a lot of stuff about how different stages of fermentation are really important in regards of how much oxygen exposure there is and development of acetic acid and alcohol, which all play a role in how the chocolate ends up being flavored in the end. Now, despite this channel's name, all of this is beyond my pay grade, so I took a simplistic route for fermentation, and honestly, the chocolate I ended up with was pretty good. So let's just follow my caveman attempt. So from our bowl of collected fruit, we can go ahead and place them into a very well cleaned container, preferably something like this where you can easily monitor what's going on inside. I had a little glass weight for fermentation, so I use this to weigh down the beans, although I'm not really entirely sure if this was necessary. Now, the name of the game is we're going to let this ferment for about a week, but after about 24 hours, depending on how warm it is outside, you should start to see the effects of fermentation. The beans will start to change color and they'll also expel liquid. Traditionally, these are fermented in giant wooden crate where there's drainage and the expelled liquid can drain away from the beans. But for this small amount of cocoa beans, it didn't
This is gross.
really seem to make a huge difference. About once every day or so, I would like to open up the container, stir it up with a clean spoon, and specifically I did this on days 1, 3, and 4 of fermentation. On day 4 of fermentation, I opened up the top of the container and then covered it with a clean towel. And we're gonna let this ferment open for 2 or 3 more days, stirring every day until it looks like this. Allowing the fermented beans to be exposed to the air really helps kind of bring it to that final step. So after the full 7 days, we're actually ready to move on to the next step. Now, not only does this stuff look funky, it also smells pretty funky and a little bit alcoholic. Don't worry though, that's totally normal. Yeah. However, I do have to say, under the alcoholic funkiness, it will have an ever so slightly chocolatey smell. It almost smells like a chocolate liquor or something like that. All right, so now the next step is to dry these beans out completely. Traditionally, this is done in the sun, but the weather outside where I filmed this is cold and rainy, so that really wasn't an option for me. So I placed my beans into this combo dehydrator oven thing that I have and let it dehydrate for 24 hours. After the 24 hours, we can pull them out. And if you peel the shell off the beans, you'll see that there's actually a cocoa bean inside. And this is actually our chocolate. Now, we aren't fully there yet because we'll still need to roast it, but you can start to see that the color's almost there. And if you smell it, it will still smell a little bit funky, but it will really start to kind of have that chocolatey smell. Now, at this point, we're actually ready to roast the beans. And there's a bunch of different methods for roasting, but again, we're just gonna go through the simplistic route. Now, for this step, we're gonna do a 2-stage roast. Now, the first thing we're gonna do is we're gonna roast the beans in an oven at about 325 degrees Fahrenheit or 160 degrees Celsius for about 5 minutes. This is gonna just kind of start the roast for the beans. After the 5 minutes, turn the temperature down to 275 Fahrenheit or 135 degrees Celsius for about 20 minutes. And I was really surprised how much in this relatively short roasting time really changed the beans. This roast really made my whole house smell wonderfully warm and chocolatey. And this is the stage where it goes from kind of being funky to full on chocolatey.
So once you roast them, that's when you make it good, apparently. Okay. I guess it's like coffee in a lot of ways.
Done roasting, we can pull it out of the oven and let it cool completely. I let them sit actually for about 2 hours on the cutting board, and just to really make sure that they're completely cooled down. Now, once they are cool, we can go ahead and peel the shells off, exposing the cocoa nibs inside. And it might help a little bit to crack them first, as I'm doing here. And I'm not gonna lie, this process was a little time consuming. It's honestly not that bad. In total, it took about 10 minutes to peel all of them. Now some small fragments of shells still ended up in my cocoa nibs, and you could either use a hairdryer to blow them away, or I just simply picked them out by eye, just kind of leaning on the side of not collecting as much chocolate, but making sure that there weren't any pieces of shell left over in our container. All right, so once we have all our nibs ready, we are ready to move on to the next step, which is to grind them up and turn it into chocolate. But before you do, it's not a bad idea to weigh the total amount of cocoa nibs you've collected, and that'll help kind of inform how much stuff to add later when we're making the chocolate bars. All right, so to start off with grinding, I used a mortar.
I'm doing good. How are you doing, Jenny? I'm doing all right. It's Sunday fun day, baby.
Pestle to break
learning
up
how to make some chocolate. This is like a way more involved, complicated process than I ever imagined.
the cocoa nibs. I was able to get a pretty rough grind at first using this method. Now, to be frank, if you want to be able to get the level of smoothness of a commercial chocolate bar, you need a special piece of equipment known as a conch. And these will run you about $300. So, you know, that's kind of out of the budget for my video here. So instead, I experimented with grinding these cocoa
really
nibs
looks like coffee,
with
though. Now it really looks like coffee.
Stuff I already have. This was an experiment, so feel free to mix and match how I did this to whatever works best for you. Now, I poured the crushed cocoa nibs into a blender and let this go. And I also took this opportunity to add a little sugar. This will help balance the bitterness of the chocolate, and how much you add is completely up to you. I'm more of a fan of the darker side of chocolate, so I only added about 20 grams of sugar to the chocolate, which gave me about an 85% dark chocolate. But if you want to add more, or also add milk powder to cut the bitterness down, feel free to do that. So using the blender did produce a much finer grind. However, it was constantly getting stuck in the corners and getting kind of really annoying to deal with. So I decided I got it somewhat fine. I would try to finish it in the mortar and pestle again. Back in the mortar and pestle, after about 10 minutes of vigorous work, I ended up with as fine as I was able to get it, which to be frank, wasn't too fine. Now, I also know it looks like there's some big chunks here, but those are actually just clumps of fine powder that got compacted in the mortar and pestle. All right, so
actually,
the cocoa
I did a better job than it looks like I did on video here.
It has some natural oil in each of the beans. This is the stuff that is known as cocoa butter. Now, depending on how well we were able to grind this down, the cocoa butter will actually express itself into the powder and will kind of form a chocolatey liquid. However, as you can see, this isn't very oily and it's actually very dry. So we'll need to bolster this cocoa with some cocoa butter. So to my 120 grams of cocoa nibs, I added initially about 20 grams of cocoa butter, but I actually added about 10 more grams later. So for a total of 30 grams of cocoa butter. The cocoa butter will give us that chocolate bar texture, but first we need to melt it. So I popped this into the microwave for about 2 minutes, and you really want to keep a close eye on this. It might be different for your microwave. You really want this just to melt. You don't want it to overheat. Once it's melted, it should look like this, and just go ahead and add it into the chocolate and stir it up. Now we're in the stage of melting, tempering, and molding the chocolate. Place the cocoa over a pot of boiling water to make a double boiler. This will begin to melt everything together. However, even after heating, my chocolate still looked a little dry, so this is when I added that 10 more grams of cocoa butter I mentioned earlier. And this really seemed to do the trick. We can see here now that we have a texture of something that almost looks like wet brownie mix, and that's actually what we're going after. Now, while heating the chocolate, we really want to keep an eye on the temperature. Now that the chocolate is melted, we need to temper the chocolate. Now, this is a process where we basically align the crystals that form inside of the chocolate to form a uniform, solid, hard bar. If we don't do this step, the chocolate crystals will kind of have a random orientation and we'll end up with something mushy and won't really snap when you break the chocolate bar. Now, there's a million different ways to do tempering. Some involve using a marble slab and some metal spatulas. The easiest way is using something called beta crystals, which are just crystals of cocoa butter. But for me, the most practical way of doing this, and just kind of the easiest way, is just to use a nice piece of dark chocolate from a chocolate bar. And this is what's known as seed tempering. And this will provide a seed crystal for the chocolate to kind of form around and help align the chocolate. So to do this, let the chocolate cool down, and once it reaches about 91 degrees Fahrenheit or 31 degrees Celsius, add a piece of dark chocolate from a nice chocolate bar into the melted cocoa and just stir it until it's fully melted. All right, now while it's still molten, go ahead and pour this into a mold. I'm using a silicone chocolate mold I got online, and that seemed to work pretty well. Carefully pour the chocolate in, and it doesn't hurt to give it the old tappa to coax out any air bubbles. Once the molds are filled, it's just a matter of letting this thing cool down completely. For me, I left this in the fridge overnight. Now, the next morning, I returned for the moment of truth. I think it's beautiful. I couldn't have been any happier with these chocolate bars, at least how they look. Now, how did it taste? Well, as I said before, it was a little grainy, but that doesn't really bother me. The taste, however, was fantastic. It really had that nice, complicated, fruity, chocolatey flavor you get from a high-end chocolate bar. And I have to say, it was a really fun process. And even though I had some issues, it was extremely interesting and gratifying to be able to make my own chocolate bar all by myself. I really hope that you actually, if you have the time and energy and want, that you actually try this process yourself. If you get stuck anywhere or you have your own...
That just seems like way too much fucking work to make a little bit of chocolate. I mean, that's... probably tastes really good or whatever, but like, I don't know, you could just buy that shit.
Questions. I'm by no means an expert in the topic. I can share my experiences with you. Feel free to email me at my website, flavorlab@flavorlab.xyz. So if you enjoyed this video, please consider sharing it. Sometimes these longer videos don't get a lot of views and it's always difficult. All right, that's it for this week. If you have something you want me to make for you, please feel free to leave it in the comments down below.
Look at the cola.
Hi everyone. So today we're going to make some cola. Now the final product...
I've never actually known what was like in like cola, like Coke and shit. Like it's always just it was like syrup to me. There's like fruit in it and cinnamon. I thought it was just like was its own flavor. I thought Coke or cola was just like cola.
was pretty close to what you might get at the store and what you might be expecting, but I'll let you be the judge. So you guys have probably all had some form of cola before, so I really don't need to introduce it. We can just go straight into the recipe. Now the recipe can be broken down into 3 main parts. We first have a flavoring, which is called 7X, the cola flavoring. We need to prepare the other components that go into the soda syrup, and then we need to cook all this stuff together to actually make the syrup.
Sugar's good for you. Don't tell Andrea that. She'll get mad at us. Yeah, I'm looking at only sugary stuff this morning, I guess. Whatever. Can we clone Dr. Pepper? Okay, well, I'm not switching from this one. Root beer from scratch? Oh, root beer is pretty cool. I do like root beer. Got him.
So the first thing that we're going to need to do is make the flavoring. And to do this, you can use all essential oils, which is what the original recipe calls for. But since I really didn't want to spend 40 euros on essential oils, I instead tried to make my own 7X flavor compound using the actual ingredients that make up the essential oils. And this was a little bit more work, but I mean, in the end, it worked the same. So we just need the following ingredients.
What the fuck is... Okay, orange peel, lemon peel, cinnamon, nutmeg, coriander. What the fuck is neroli? What is neroli? Have you ever heard of neroli? Neroli is an essential oil produced from a blossom of the bitter orange tree. Its scent is sweet, honeyed, and somewhat metallic with green and spicy facets. Orange blossom is also extracted from the same blossom, and both extracts are extensively used in perfumery. Weird that it says the flashpoint on there, but okay. It's one of the most widely used floral oils in perfumery. Like many raw materials, neroli can cause sensitization due to high content of aromatic tartness. What is tartness? So certain compounds, linalool, a bunch of words. It blends very well with any citrus oil. And you drinking this stuff? You drinking perfume shit? What the fuck? Most of the synthetic components available on the market also has a limited use in flavoring. Neroli oil is repeatedly one of the ingredients in a closely guarded secret recipe for Coca-Cola. It's flavoring ingredient of open source cola recipes, although some variants consider it as optional, considering high cost. Okay. Sounds Italian. It does sound Italian. Neroli.
To actually make the flavoring. We need 10 grams of an orange peel. We need 10 grams of a lemon peel. We need 4 grams of cinnamon, which is about 1 stick. We need about 1 gram of nutmeg, 1 gram of coriander seeds, and lastly, 4 grams of neroli or bitter orange peel. But I really couldn't find these, so I did some research and found out that kaffir lime leaves are comprised of 80% of the same flavonoid compound, and so I used 4 grams of those instead. And
neroli, this person used lime leaves anyway. Okay.
Kind of funny thing you realize when you're making this is actually that cola is really just a citrusy lemon drink with some spices in it. Anyways, it's kind of weird. So now that we have our 7 ingredients that make up the quote-unquote 7X flavoring, we need to actually get the flavors out of these ingredients. And essentially, you would do this by having some sort of essential oil, where you have a carrier oil that's holding the flavor compounds that make up these flavors. Now, there's plenty of ways to actually get these flavors out or these essential oils out. You can use stuff like steam distillation. You can soak them in oil for about a month or so, but I was in a bind for time, so I wanted to attempt a shortcut, which was to pound them in a mortar and pestle and then put them into a pot with about 75 milliliters or 5 tablespoons of coconut oil. This will act as a carrier oil and basically we'll heat this up and strain out the coconut oil later, and hopefully all the flavor
really good when you cook it down really slow. Like when you do like seasoning, like spices and shit, like for like in the fall.
This will come with it. So the next step is to take this pounded mixture and steep these ingredients in oil while heating it over low heat for about 30 minutes. So we just simply need to put this pan on the stove, let it sit for about 30 minutes, and then pull it off. So after the 30 minutes were up, I strained off the coconut oil, and what we're left with is a super fragrant Coke flavored oil. that has all of the flavor compounds from the ingredients that were simmering in it. So now we have a slight problem here, which is that the flavors are dissolved within this oil, and we want to use water for the rest of our cola. Now, as you know, water and oil repel each other, so how do we get these two to mix? Well, we can use an emulsifying agent. Now, we have two options here. One is, which is the method I'm going to use, is to use alcohol as the emulsifying agent. Now, the amount of alcohol we'll use here is so minimal that it'll be virtually non-existent in the final Coke. But if you don't want to emulsify using alcohol, that's completely understandable. You can also use something called gum arabic, which is what's typically used in regular cola. It's apparently pretty easy to find online. Just make sure that you get food-grade stuff and not stuff made for art. So I'm going to use the alcohol method, and for that I'm using 10 milliliters of alcohol. And I'm going to use the moonshine that I've made in a previous video because it's a semi-neutral flavor and it's mostly ethanol, which is what we're after. We can then add 3 tablespoons of our flavored oil, and then we need to whisk both the alcohol and oil together until they become very tiny dots, so tiny that you can't see them. It should also be stable and not separate again after a few seconds. Now, once we have our emulsified mixture, we can move on to the next step, which is preparing the rest of our ingredients. So first off, we have our sugar. Now, in retrospect, I would recommend about half the sugar here, but I'm not really a fan of the overly sweet colas that you find at the store. But if you are a fan of those kinds of sodas, you can use the originally called for amount, which is 600 grams. If you want it a little bit less sweet, you can add a little bit less.
How much cola?
We'll also need another 100 grams to caramelize.
How much fucking cola is this? Is this like one, like a jar, like a gallon? Like, how much is this?
And this will help with the color and the flavor. We'll just separate this to the side. Next, we need 3.5 grams of citric acid. And lastly, we need 500 milliliters or about 1 lime's worth of lime juice. Now, the version I'm making will be caffeine free, but if you choose to add some caffeine, it would be good to prepare that right now as well. And lastly, we need 500 milliliters or about 2 cups worth of water. Okay, now that we've gathered all the ingredients, we can actually work on creating the cola syrup. Now here, we want to take those 100 grams that we've separated out for the caramelization, and we're going to simply pour this into a pan over medium-low heat and let the pan heat up. Now be sure to stir the sugar as it starts to melt. As it starts to melt, it will also start to turn brown, and this is exactly what we want. At the point where the sugar has completely melted and we have a nice brown color, we can go ahead and add in our 500 milliliters of water. Once we add the water, it will immediately seize up and crystallize, but don't worry. Just try to stir this mixture up, and eventually the caramel will begin to dissolve in the water again. And once it has, we can go ahead and add in the rest of our sugar. We can then add in the citric acid and lastly the lime juice. Now, I've always heard that Coca-Cola without any food coloring would be green, and I didn't really believe it. But after adding the lime juice, the whole syrup that I was making turned green actually, and you can see it here. To give it a little more of a realistic Coke color, I personally will be adding in some black food coloring that I have. But that part is completely optional and up to you. So once everything's mixed, we can pull the syrup off the stove.
We're learning how to make cola. I don't know, I just sort of like went down the Flavor Lab rabbit hole, and now we just watched how to make chocolate, and now we watched how to make cola. Weird, right? Welcome to Sunday Fun Day.
And let it cool down. I let mine cool down for a few hours, at which point it's time to make a soda. You simply need 2 tablespoons of syrup for about 12 ounces or about 330 milliliters of soda water. Yeah, so you just pour the syrup in, then you pour the water in. But I also recommend to adjust the syrup ratio for your personal taste. Give it a good mix with a spoon and then add a few ice cubes. And that's it. It tasted similar, but not quite the same as a regular Coke. In the future, I definitely will reduce the amount of sugar and play with the flavoring ratios a little bit more to try to make it a little closer to the Coke you'd find in a store. Okay. But in my personal opinion, that's where all the fun is. So I hope you enjoyed this video. And if you did, please be sure to check out some of my other content. And thanks for watching. Bye.
All right, cool. I don't know, like, let's watch the root beer one.
Hi everyone, so today we're going to be tackling root beer, and boy was this video a doozy. Now it's not that making root beer is actually difficult, but based on the title you may notice there's definitely a way not to make root beer. And so following the traditional recipe for root beer can actually get you into trouble, and this is something I learned the hard way. Now before I get into that, I want to discuss the history and give some context to this historic North American drink. So it turns out that root beer is actually the culmination of several cultural roots. Now, the primary ingredient in root beer is the root sassafras, which comes from the sassafras tree. And this tree is found in the modern-day United States and was cultivated and boiled into a tea by the indigenous peoples of North America. The other root from root beer comes from a long history of what are known as small beers. And a small beer is essentially a drink that contains a small amount of alcohol, usually between 0.5 and 2.8%. And though it wasn't known at the time, the alcohol in the beer helped kill pathogens, which kind of, in a way, treated the poor water quality in Europe. Now, small beers are made in a bunch.
It's something that's not just for root beer. Like historically, like in throughout the world, really, like alcoholic beverages were often made. One, because they get you fucked up, but two, because they were actually like a method of treating like the horrible water that before like modern water treatment, where you can actually like make sure that water is safe to drink without dying. You would need to have you might need to have some kind of something in there or do something with it, so that like making it into different things other than just plain water was a method of treating it.
Of different methods, as were regular beers at the time, but small beers were typically brewed with roots, berries, and barks. One of the really prominent ones is actually birch beer. And recipes for birch beer were kind of the first ones written down, with the first real recipe being written on how to ferment the tar of birch into a birch beer, outlined in Vinetium Britannicum. And this was published in 1678, which is only 11 years after Isaac Newton published his theory of gravitation. So this is quite old. So I'm going to include a snippet from Vinetium Britannicum that basically outlines how they actually would have made birch beer. And the basic gist of this is that they'd actually just take birch, sugar, yeast, and they would add some cinnamon and mace, and then basically close up the barrel and let it kind of carbonate. Now, although it's not surprising that yeast and sugar would make a small beer, there's also a second...
Birch tar, sugar, yeast, and spices.
And let it kind of carbonate. Now, although it's not surprising that yeast and sugar would make a small beer, there's also a secondary characteristic that we associate with root beer at play here too, which is carbonation. Yeast will take sugar and convert it into alcohol, giving off CO2, and if this process is done in a sealed container, such as a barrel or bottle, the CO2 will be absorbed into the liquid and carbonate the drink. So let's fast forward to colonial North America, and the cultural tradition of making small beers is brought to the colonies. Now, the traditional ingredients such as cinnamon and mace are a little bit more difficult to acquire. And so now there's a need to make small beers with the ingredients that they have on hand. And they look to the indigenous peoples of North America who've been brewing sassafras tea. And so some recipes for how to make root beer start to pop up using sassafras. So root beer, alongside its close relative sarsaparilla, were touted as health tonics, claiming to cleanse the blood and improve circulation, and other ingredients such as burdock root, dandelion, sweet gale, and evergreen were eventually added. Now, root beer, as far as we know, started appearing around 1860, at which point companies like A&W and Barks come onto the stage, and the popularity of root beer really starts to blow up. And this is also around the same time that Coca-Cola starts to, make a dent. So actually, when I was young, I grew up in the southeastern part of the United States. And root beer, I remember from the time, was not really as sweet.
We've done it, folks. We've seen Flavor Lab's face. We know who he is now. We have a face to the name.
It was more of a medicinally herby flavor. And so in my quest to actually find out why this was the case, I may have actually poisoned myself. Studies of lab mice exposed...
Say that again?
United States. And root beer, I remember from the time, was not really as sweet. It was more of a medicinally herby flavor. And so in my quest to actually find out why this was the case, I may have actually poisoned myself. Studies of lab mice exposed to the primary chemical compounds contained in sassafras, known as safrole, contained carcinogenic properties within lab rats. This led to the FDA banning sassafras in commercial production of root beer around the 1960s.
Really?
And this kind of ultimately ended root beer as we know it, or as it was known at the time. Very quickly, they were able to kind of fill this gap by replacing safrole with different flavors and kind of leaning more heavily on vanilla and sugar and honey flavors, which has kind of led to the root beer that we know. So actually, I was very close to actually finishing this video a few months ago. I had filmed it, I had edited it, I had, gotten everything ready and was about to upload it. And then actually on a whim, I started to look a little bit more into sassafras. And one of the things that I found was, of course, the toxicity due to safrole. And so during that process, when I was cooking it, I actually did a bunch of taste tests, including even on the concentrated syrup. And I'm sure that definitely exceeded my daily allowance for saffron. And I'm not really sure what the consequences will be long term, but hopefully they're not that bad. There seems to be a lot of controversy on how toxic saffron
And I guess
actually
he's fine.
is, and additional concerns
It's
of
2
if
years
the
later and he's still doing videos, so I guess he's fine.
method that's used to determine the cancer rates in rats are even applicable to humans. All that being said, I don't recommend testing this, and honestly, I wouldn't trust a guy who accidentally poisoned himself because he didn't do proper research beforehand. So with all that being said, I'm going to show you how to make root beer that tastes similar to the old-fashioned stuff, but without the cancer risk. So we're going to achieve that by trying to remove the saffron from the sassafras that we're going to use to make the root beer. So let's actually get started with making a root beer. So the first thing we're going to need is actually some sassafras, and this stuff comes in a dried root form and can be found in either your local homebrew store or...
So it can kill you, and it's at your health food store. Your health food store is trying to kill you, folks. Health food my ass.
Actually, I found mine in a local health food store. We're going to need to weigh off about 45 grams or about 1.5 ounce of the sassafras root into a container. We don't really need to worry about the exact amount, so plus or minus a few grams really won't hurt too much. So the next thing that we're going to need to do is actually boil this root to make a tea. And for our 40 grams of sassafras, we're going to need about 2 cups or about 500 milliliters of water. We're going to heat this water, and once it reaches boiling, go ahead and add the sassafras, and we're going to let this boil for about 10 minutes so that we can extract the flavor from it. After 10 minutes of boiling, we've extracted what we need, and it's time to filter off the roots from our quote-unquote tea. Now, if we're going to make this the old-fashioned way, we would continue on from here, but since we want to reduce the amount of potentially carcinogenic saffron from the sassafras tea, we're going to need to implement a technique here known as freeze distillation. And that sounds a bit complicated, but in our case, actually, it's going to be very easy. The key here is that saffron freezes at about 11 degrees Celsius or about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, which is actually a lot higher than where water freezes, like near 32 degrees Fahrenheit or 0 Celsius. This means that if we cool the tea down to below the freezing point of saffron but above the freezing point of water, we'll have frozen saffron crystals suspended in our liquid water, which we can then filter out. So to bring the temperature of the tea down, I put the tea into the freezer just to kind of rapidly cool down, and then after about an hour, I moved it into the fridge so that it could sit there overnight. In the meantime, I'm also going to place the filters that I'm going to use, which in my case are a sieve and a cheesecloth. I'm also going to place those into the freezer. And this is just going to help with when I actually filter that they won't actually warm up the crystals and kind of cause them to re-liquefy. So the next day we're actually ready to filter off our crystals. So the first thing I want to do is kind of measure the temperature of the sassafras tea and see if we're in the right ballpark. I measured a temperature of about 34.8 degrees Fahrenheit or about 1.55 degrees Celsius, which puts us kind of right in the sweet spot for what we hoped. We're above the freezing temperature of water, but we're below 50 degrees Fahrenheit where saffron freezes. So I started...
Basically, you just have to do a whole bunch of stuff to make sure this stuff doesn't kill you. Cool.
By pulling our cheesecloth and sieve out of the freezer, and I'm just going to use the sieve at first to filter off most of the granular sized crystals. And as you can see, a lot of stuff collected. I'm not sure that all of it's saffron, but I'm guessing that some of it may have coagulated with other particulates. Now, honestly, this isn't the most scientific method for separating saffron out, but our main goal isn't to remove all of the saffron, just to remove as much as possible. I mean, after all, saffron can be found in things like strawberries and basil. So if we can kind of just reduce the strength of that within the tea, then we're doing already pretty good. So once we have our filtered saffron tea, we're ready to finish up with the other ingredients and actually continue the recipe as if we were making root beer. From here, we're actually going to need to boil some other ingredients that are going to give us these root beer flavors. The first thing that we're going to need is kind of a unique ingredient that I actually hadn't heard of before I started this project. It's known as sweet gale or bog myrtle. To balance the sweetness of root beer, we need a little bit of bitter. In real beer, this is mostly accomplished with hops, but in root beer, this is traditionally done with something known as sweet gale, which actually sometimes can be used as a replacement for hops in regular beer. If you can't find this, feel free to use neutral hops or just kind of try to omit the bittering agent entirely. You can get kind of a more sweet root beer that way. For this, we're going to need about 2 grams, which is what I have entirely in this bag, so we'll just pour this in. Next, we're going to need some spices to give a nice flavor to the root beer, and feel free to kind of amp up or omit these, but I'm adding 1 star anise, about 30 juniper berries to give a piney flavor, and 1 cinnamon stick, which I've broken up. Next, I'm going to add about 1 pinch of cassava powder. And this is a starch that will kind of help give us this foamy, frothy top to our root beer like you see in the movies or maybe you associate it with. It doesn't really change the taste too much. It's just there to kind of give us that foaminess. Alternatively, you could use 1 tablespoon of oatmeal, or you can just omit this entirely. And lastly, behind sassafras, the second primary ingredient we need actually is wintergreen. And it's only included this last because when I started filming, I forgot that I didn't have any of this. I had to go back to the homebrew store, and I had already filmed everything else. Wintergreen is actually an evergreen that's native to North America, and it kind of gives this like minty flavor that you may not realize is there in root beer actually. So for wintergreen, we need about 25 grams, which I'm measuring in the most scientific method possible, which is just that I know this, I need half of this bag. Now, to sweeten the root beer, there's several options on the table. One option would be to use plain sugar. You could use molasses, or you could use honey, or any combination of those.
Molasses.
But for me, I'm going to use some light malt syrup to kind of give my root beer a light malty flavor. Now, that's not strictly necessary, and feel free to use whichever one that you choose. You may have to adjust the amounts though, but that's really going to depend on your sweetness taste and how much you like your root beer to be extremely sweet or not sweet at all. I'm going to measure out for my malt syrup. I'm going to use about 2 pounds or about 1 kilogram. So now that we have the spices together and our sweetener measured out, we can begin boiling the rest of our ingredients. We can begin to heat up our sassafras tea with the saffron removed, and we can also add our spice mixture into it. And we're just going to bring this up to a boil again and let this go for another 10 minutes, at which point we can take it off the burner and filter off the flavoring spices, just as we had done with the sassafras earlier. Now that we have a strained liquid, we can just add some other flavoring ingredients that we want to stick in there, starting with a little bit of vanilla extract. And I'm also going to add a little bit of molasses, more for flavor and color than for the sweetness. If you want my exact amounts that I used, feel free to look in the description of the video down below. So with our strained liquid and flavors all in our pot, we can put this all back on the heat. And we can now add our sweetener and just kind of give this a good mix. So as this heats up, keep an eye on it. If it starts to boil over, reduce the heat and very gently stir. You don't really want to have a boil over of this stuff. We're going to want to boil this mixture until it reaches about half of its current level, and we want to end up with a syrupy concoction. After about 30 minutes, I ended up with something like this, which is exactly perfect. So we're going to let this cool down for about an hour, at which point we're going to set it to the side, and we can pour this into a bottle or some sort of glass for storing and kind of cool this down further. So, but in the end, I mean, this is our root beer syrup. So if we actually want to make a root beer, it's really simple. All we need to do is get some of the syrup in a glass, and we're going to just add some carbonated water. I'm just using water from a soda stream, but if you just wanted
no soda stream. Soda stream's on the BDS list.
Carbonated water you could add to the syrup. You give this a very slight stir, and bam, you got yourself a root beer. It was really delicious, and it was almost exactly like I remembered as a kid. So it has these nice flavors of, I don't know how to describe it other than more earthy and kind of almost medicinal. Anyways, I hope that you make this, and if you do, please let me know. If you haven't already, please consider subscribing to this channel. And also, one last note is I have a handful of stickers that I kind of want to give away to people who want them for free. If you want one, just make sure that you're subbed to the channel and leave a comment saying that you want one, and I'll try to get in contact with you, at least for some of you. I don't know how, I mean, I only have a handful of stickers, so we'll see how this goes. But anyways, thank you for watching, and I'll hopefully see you guys soon. Bye.
All right. So one more food video. It's going to be from somebody else, so I don't want to just watch.
Hi, guys. So today we're going to
be... Shut up. Why is autoplay on? Off. Let's see. This is beef jerky. Now I don't want to watch beef jerky. It's like you just dry the shit. And you salt the fuck out of it. It's really bad for you too. Huh. All right, here's the brew your own beer one. Let's try this. Let's check out that one. What the fuck? He's got a lucha. Whoa, hold on a second. He got like a Lucha Libre fucking luchador ass bottle opener. Hell yes. Where do I get that from? That's awesome.
Look, I'm gonna be honest. I don't really like beer that much. Yeah, probably not the best way to start this one out, but that's the exact reason why you should start brewing your own beer. I'll explain. It is a Saison, aka a French farmhouse ale. It sounds super fancy, but in my opinion, it is the most perfect beginner beer to make, period. It's because the yeast that is used in this, you can do it in your own house at room temperature. This beer is gosh darn delicious. Now remember, you gotta be 21 years or older to be drinking, so if you're watching this video and you're younger, hey, thank you. Don't forget to hit that like button, but do not drink any alcohol.
Very bad.
Now with that, let's go ahead and make this, shall we?
Now, before we get started, we're going to need to talk about equipment. Not something I usually like to discuss, but it's important for this. Now, for the record, I will have a detailed document that has all this listed in the description. So let's just talk about the bare essentials. The main thing that you need is a fermenter, which will be a 6.5 gallon carboy, plus an airlock and a stopper, and then a large enough pot that can easily hold 5 gallons, a muslin grain sack to steep your grains. Yes, sack is funny. And a racking cane. That's it. That's all you're going to need. Beer brewers, if you're watching, we're going to talk about hydrometers. Let's just wait for that, all right? So as a part of the recipe, I'm actually getting some sanitizer liquid prepared because the most important part to brewing is sanitizing. Every single brewer will tell you this. You must sanitize everything that the finished wort is going to touch. Otherwise, you risk some major health hazards, which, by the way, I'll explain what that is in just a moment. That same document in the description will also have a list of stuff that you need to sanitize just to help you out. Now, for the ingredients, you're going to need a couple different grains that are just sort of cracked. And a lot of local homebrew shops will do this for you. I actually went to a local homebrew shop called Soko Homebrew, and they had all the grains that I needed, and they cracked them for me, and I literally just walked away with a sack of grains and did it. So I would really recommend looking for some local homebrew shops because it'll make your life a lot easier, but of course you can also get it all online. Last, the yeast that we're going to use is going to be W yeast 3711 French Saison yeast. Yeah, a lot of words. Don't try and use your sourdough starter, and don't use bread yeast for this. You need to use this specific yeast. The cool thing about this pack is it just makes it so easy. You just give it a little slap and then just let it sit out at room temperature for a few hours until it starts to puff up, and then you can use it. Now, we're ready to actually make the beer. So you're going to fill the grain sack with all these different cracked grains. 1.5 pounds of Belgian Pilsen, 12 ounces of German wheat, 12 ounces of aromatic wheat, 8 ounces of special roast, and 4 ounces of Caramunic malt. Now, I know these are a lot of fancy terminologies, like they're literally just different types of grain. That's it. Now, just tie off your sack, then drop your sack into 3 gallons of water that's been heated to 160 degrees Fahrenheit. Make sure to dunk it in and out to make sure that it's hydrated, and let it steep for 1 hour, maintaining that temperature. Make sure to check the temperature every 10 minutes or so. Now, while that's going, I'm going to sanitize my carboy. Do not forget to sanitize this, and also the airlocks. Now, once that's steep, lift your sack out of the water and do not squeeze it. Instead, you're going to take 4 cups of hot water and you're going to strain that through the bag and let it drain until it stops dripping. Then discard the grains and bring this liquid to a boil. Oh, and to that, you're also going to want to add 5 pounds of Pilsen Light liquid malt extract. This sugary liquid is now known as the wort. Now, as soon as that comes to a boil, set your timer for 1 hour and toss in 1/2 ounce of Sriracha hops. And then you're just going to let that bad boy continuously boil for that hour. Now, when 20 minutes remain out of that hour, we're going to add
fucking pellets that you would give your rabbit.
As soon as that comes to a boil, set your timer
that looks pretty gross.
For 1 hour and toss in 1/2 ounce of Sriracha hops. And then you're just going to let that bad boy continuously boil for that hour. Now, when 20 minutes remain out of that hour, we're going to add a couple different spices, which will be 3 grams of grains of paradise, 10 grams of coriander, and 65 grams of peeled sliced fresh galangal, which is basically like ginger. You can also use ginger if you don't have galangal. Wrap those in cheesecloth and tie it off with kitchen twine to make a bag, and then toss it in your boiling wort at the 20-minute mark. Then at the 10-minute mark, you're going to add 1 ounce of Styrian Goldings hops, and then just finish out the boil with that 10 minutes remaining. Now, once that 10 minutes is up, you need to let the wort cool down to 80 degrees Fahrenheit before you add the yeast. I usually like to do this by setting a little ice bath in my kitchen sink and plugging up my sink. Please be aware that at this point, the wort is in its most fragile state. You cannot let anything touch this that has not been totally sanitized. Once the wort reaches 80 degrees Fahrenheit, you can funnel it into your sanitized carboy using your sanitized funnel. Then top it off with enough filtered water to reach the 5-gallon mark. Now, at this point, a lot of brewers will check the specific gravity with a hydrometer so that they can determine its alcohol content at the end. Now, it's recommended, but not a requirement, and you will just follow the instructions to take the reading, which, if you do, the specific gravity should be around 1.050. Now, my liquid yeast is ready because it's been sitting out. I already gave it a good pop on the bottom. So make sure you sanitize the bag, sanitize a pair of scissors, and then cut open a little end of it, and then pitch it directly into your beer. Then add your prepared airlock and its stopper.
The reason that he's got to sanitize everything is because, when you I guess because like it's got yeast involved, and if any kind of like bacteria or mold or anything gets anything, it's just gonna go crazy.
Make sure that it's fully locked down on your carboy. Then let it ferment at
Wait,
room
what is that?
temperature. It has a pair of scissors, and then cut open a little end of it, and then pitch it directly into your beer. Then add your prepared airlock and its stopper.
airlock.
Make sure that it's fully locked down on your carboy. Then let it ferment at room temperature in a dark area with no sunlight for 14 days. Make sure that there's no sunlight at all.
Fuck. 14
Oh, hey, so you might be wondering why you're in my room right now next to my bed in a beer video. Weird. Yeah, it's weird. So, we're in my room
Cringe,
because
bro.
of this. Well, not this, but what it's hiding. What I'm doing here is I'm blocking the light so that this stays in the darkness. So this whole weird bit was basically just to make a point about that. So yeah, keep your beer out of the light. Thank you.
Bro,
Thank you very
knock
much.
it off,
After the
dude.
first few
Please
days, you
stop.
should notice a couple of things. A, your airlock is bubbling. You've got a foamy head on top, which is called krausen. And at the bottom, you'll notice the yeast cake and then some other gases developing and lots of bubbles happening. These are all good signs, and just let it go for those 14 days as described. Now, once you've hit that 14-day mark, it's time to bottle. Make sure that you're sanitizing your bottles and your bottle caps and your bottle capper. Yes, everything. After that, make sure to prime all your bottles with priming sugar. I personally like to use conditioning tablets because they're just easy. These are just pure corn sugar. I'll do about 4 to 5 tabs per bottle. Now, this is where you're going to need an auto siphon and a bottle filler, both of which are, guess
Wait,
what?
what was that?
Sanitized. After that, make sure to prime all your bottles with priming sugar. I personally like to use
Priming
conditioning
sugar.
tablets because
Oh,
they're just
okay.
easy. These are just pure corn sugar. I'll do about 4 to 5 tabs per bottle. Now, this is where you're going to need an auto siphon and a bottle filler, both of which are, guess what? Sanitized. Surprised by that? Probably not. Now, to fill my bottles, I attach my racking cane to a siphon and then the other end to a bottle filler. You want to carefully place your siphon in your beer, but whatever you do not touch the bottom or siphon any of that yeast cake at the bottom. That's the trub. It's very yucky. Don't get it. Carefully pump your beer through the siphon and press down on the bottom of a beer bottle to get it to start filling. Gravity should sort of do the rest for you. Then fill your bottle all the way up to the top and pull your siphon out. You should notice the liquid drop to a good spot. Some of these bottles of mine were actually underfilled, so yeah, don't do that. Repeat with all your bottles. Then using a bottle capper, cap your bottles. You know, it's fun. Even better if you have a buddy helping you like my boy Chris from the restaurant I used to work at. Once you're done, place these bottles back in that dark place, put them in some sort of a box in case one explodes, and let them bottle condition at room temperature for 3 weeks. Make sure that they're all capped,
Damn, this
by the way,
takes like a
if I didn't
month?
clarify that enough. After those 3 weeks are up, make some room in your fridge because these boys are gonna wreak havoc on the space in there. Stock your chili boy with beers and let them get nice and cold for at least 24 hours. Oh my God. Okay. I know the frig is open. There. After that, I would recommend using a bottle opener to pour and then drink the beer that you made. Enjoy it, and don't forget to flex on your friends because you made this and you should be proud. But you know what makes me proud? B-roll.
Should I like try it? I don't know. It seems like a lot. That's a fucking like big undertaking. I don't like. I've been thinking about doing that since like probably for at least like 10 years. I don't know. If I do make beer, I'll try and be less cringe than this guy.
So I'm editing the video right now, and it has occurred to me that I never actually explained why I got into brewing beer when I don't even like it. There really is such a thing as a beer out there that is for you. And the problem is brewers aren't making beer for you. They're making it for them, for what they like, for what they think other people will like. But that doesn't mean that you're going to like it. So the beauty of brewing your own beer is, well, that you get to make it however you flippin' want, dude. All right, guys, and that is it. So let's make this one quick because I had to drink a lot of beer to film this, and I'm really feeling it right now. Okay, I still have more to film before I get drunk. If you're a beer lover, then that's a no-brainer. But if you don't like beer, but you like a fun kitchen project, beer brewing is a perfect candidate. Once you have that level of control, and you guys know how I feel about having the control over everything, in food. And it's so fun. Now, around the time that you might be watching this, I'm probably getting all prepared to go to San Francisco to film a very special group of people for a very special 9th video. And don't forget to follow me on Instagram and Twitter. That's all in the links in the description. Please, it's much appreciated. Don't forget to DM me all the stuff that you're making. And with all that said, if you enjoyed this video or you learned something, leave a like, subscribe, and I will see you next time. I'm kind of trying to learn how to close this without hitting the...
There you go. Now you know how to make beer, chat. Now you know how to make beer. All right. That's going to be it for today. Today was kind of a lazy Sunday. Just watching some videos. Wow, what a weird... Oh, gosh. But yeah, I will be back tomorrow. We're probably going to talk about the Trump speech tomorrow. I don't know how long it was. If it's not too long, I'll cover it. But, you know, he fucking talks forever. Maybe I can find like some clips from it, and maybe that would be the way to do it. But yeah, Trump's back. Maybe we'll go over that tomorrow. Also, we never did talk about the Fauci emails. I don't think anybody cares about the Fauci emails. We'll probably talk about that at least a little bit, maybe. I don't know. And then like we just the other day, was it yesterday or the day before? I don't remember. I think it was yesterday. We watched that Murder of Fred Hampton video by Vox, which was like surprisingly good. I was actually kind of surprised by it, but I think that I talked to Dan Simpson, who is Kenzo's producer for Meet the Left, and he said that there was like another video that was on there that had a lot more raw footage. So I'm gonna try and find that. So yeah. Anyway, as far as today, we're gonna be wrapping it up. But you can support Good Morning Comrade by going to patreon.com/Good Morning Comrade. You can be like Ty Jitty, like Michael H, like Dan O, Jonathan H, Timothy C, Dragon Slayer 19, Andy L, Gary W, Rachel K, Kenneth F, and new subscribers Adam R and Trey M. All right, folks. I will see you tomorrow. I love each and every one of you. Goodbye.